The rumors came first soft and shapeless, drifting up from Dry Creek Post like smoke. Jonah McCrae heard them from the supply clerk. Talk of the old rancher up on Sable Mesa, who'd taken in Apache Widows during the winter. Some said it was pity, others called it scandal. Either way, people were watching again. Jonah rode home with the taste of iron in his mouth. The trail was quiet, the sky thin and blue. By the time he reached the ridge, he could already see smoke rising from the cabin chimney, steady, calm, alive. But that peace now carried weight. Every kindness had a cost in the territory. Inside, the women were working as always. Kiona and Sani were boiling herbs. Ava scrubbed pots near the door. Dassen fixed a saddle strap. Nayeli was planting corn shoots near the window. Her sleeves rolled, her arms dusted with soil. She looked up as he entered. "Town?" she asked. He nodded. "They're talking. About us? About me. About who lives here." Nayeli's eyes didn't waver. "Let them talk. I don't want trouble finding you again," Jonah said. Her voice softened. "It already did, Jonah. You just met it with open hands." He couldn't argue. The memory of her first night on his porch still haunted him, the snow, the silence, her voice steady but desperate. He'd opened the gate once. There was no closing it now. That evening, while the others slept, Jonah sat alone by the fire. The papers he'd filed, those names written in ink, lay folded on the table. They were legal enough to satisfy the county clerk, but not strong enough to silence the world. Respect was harder to earn than safety. Nayeli joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You're thinking too loud," she murmured. "I'm thinking about the future," he said. "What happens when spring brings riders, questions, men who don't believe in mercy?" She knelt beside him. "Then we remind them that mercy lives here." Jonah looked at her, the flicker of firelight catching in her eyes. "You trust me that much?" "I trust what I've seen," she said. "A man who could have turned us away, but didn't. That's the only kind of law I follow." He reached for her hand then, not in passion but in truth. Their fingers fit like two halves of a prayer rough, imperfect, whole. The fire popped, and the sound carried through the cabin like a promise. Outside, wind rolled down from the hills, scattering dry leaves across the porch. The world beyond Sable Mesa still whispered its doubts, but inside, something stronger held, a quiet defiance. Jonah knew they couldn't stop the rumors, but they could outlive them, and that, in this wild country, was its own kind of victory. Morning came pale and sharp. The storm had slowed, leaving the valley wrapped in white silence. Jonah McCrae stirred from the chair by the window, the rifle still resting across his knees. His neck ached, but he didn't move right away. He listened. Inside the cabin, the 5 women still slept curled beneath wool blankets, their breath slow and even. The fire had burned down to embers. He rose quietly and stirred the coals, adding kindling until the warmth returned. The smell of smoke and coffee began to fill the room. One by one, they woke. Nayeli was first. Her dark hair hung loose over her shoulders, her eyes watchful but calm. She didn't flinch when Jonah handed her a tin cup of coffee. She just nodded once and measured the grounds like she'd done it all her life. When the others sat up, they moved with purpose. Dason checked the window seams for drafts. Kiona fetched water from the bucket and began cleaning the bowls. Sani mended a torn sleeve with thread pulled from her own hem. Ava, limping, tried to help but nearly fell until Jonah caught her elbow. She whispered a quiet thank you and looked away. They weren't guests. They were survivors who knew how to keep moving. Jonah watched them in silence, the rhythm of their work strangely steadying. After breakfast, Nayeli stepped outside, scanning the tree line. Snow still fell lightly, soft and soundless. She looked back toward Jonah and said, almost to herself, "We won't be a burden." Jonah met her eyes. "Didn't say you were." Something passed between them, not trust yet, but something close, fragile as smoke. By the third morning, the cabin no longer felt like a stranger's place. Smoke curled steady from the chimney, and the sound of work filled the air, boots on wood, metal on stone, soft voices in a language Jonah didn't know. The women moved with quiet rhythm, turning chaos into order. Dason patched the back gate using wire Jonah had left rusting behind the shed. Kiona baked flatbread over the coals, the scent of corn and ash warming the room. Sandy swept the floor until the board showed again, then began carving small marks into the mantle patterns Jonah would later realize were prayers. Ava sat by the stove, her injured foot bandaged, sewing torn sleeves together with patient hands. Jonah worked outside, splitting wood beneath a pale Sunday. When he turned, he saw Nayeli carrying logs from the pile, stubborn and slow. Her dress was torn at the hem, snow clinging to her calves, but she didn't stop. "You don't have to," he said. She looked up, breath fogging the air. "Neither do you," she replied. By afternoon, the ranch looked alive again. Smoke rose in twin plumes from cabin and shed, tools hung in neat lines. It had been years since Jonah heard laughter, faint but real, drifting from his porch. That night, they shared stew and silence. Nayeli sat nearest the fire, her face softened by light. Jonah watched her without meaning to. She didn't look away. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of something new, fragile, and human. By the time the rider reached the gate, the women had gathered at the window. Nayeli's shoulders were tense. Dason's hand already gripped the kitchen knife. The man dismounted, stamping frost from his boots. He wore a long coat and a tin star pinned to his vest. "Name's Deputy Harlan," he said. "Out of Dry Creek Post. I'm looking for 2 stolen mules. Heard someone might have passed through here." Jonah stood square in the doorway, blocking the view inside. "Haven't seen anyone," he said. His tone was calm, steady, the way you spoke to someone holding a match near dry grass. The deputy's eyes drifted past him, catching the faint outline of a figure behind the stove. Nayeli, frozen in place, the light catching the curve of her cheek. "Didn't know you had company, McCrae," Harlan said. "Temporary help," Jonah replied. "Snow came early. They got caught on the trail." The man's gaze lingered longer than Jonah liked. He stepped closer, boots creaking on the porch boards. "They from around here?" "Don't matter," Jonah said, his voice low. "They're under my roof." For a moment, only the wind answered. Then the deputy shrugged. "If you see anyone leading mules south, you let the post know." He tipped his hat and turned back toward the trees. The sound of hooves faded into the cold. When Jonah closed the door, the women were still silent. Nayeli met his eyes. "He'll talk," she said. "Maybe," Jonah answered, "but he won't come back alone." That night, the fire burned longer. They kept their coats near the door, their tools within reach. Jonah cleaned his rifle while Dason checked the window seams again. Nayeli sat by the hearth, her face lit orange by the flames. "We can leave before they return," she said. Jonah shook his head. "Out there, the snow will kill you before any lawman does." She studied him for a long moment. "Then we stay." He nodded once. "We stay." Outside, the wind howled through the valley like an old ghost searching for names it had forgotten. Inside, 6 souls waited in silence, no longer strangers, not yet safe, but bound now by the single choice that would define them all. By nightfall, the storm returned softer this time, like a whisper instead of a warning. Jonah sat by the window, sharpening his knife, while the women worked quietly around the cabin. The air felt heavier, every breath wrapped in unspoken worry. None of them said it aloud, but they knew the deputy's visit had changed everything. Nayeli was the first to break the silence. She sat by the hearth, her hands steady though her voice was low. "If they come back, they won't ask questions next time." Jonah looked up from his work. "Then we'll be ready." Dason nodded, moving to check the door latch again. Kiona began stacking wood closer to the stove. Ava and Sonny mended sacks by the fire, their fingers trembling only slightly. Survival, Jonah realized, had its own language, the sound of fabric pulled tight, of water heating, of tools being readied without orders. When the last log was added, Jonah finally spoke. "You could still leave before dawn. There's a trail that cuts west toward the pass." Nayeli turned to face him. Her expression didn't change. "And freeze before sunrise? You know better than that." Their eyes held her defiance, meeting his fatigue. Something about her steadiness unsettled him. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right. "Then we stay," he said. Later that night, as the fire dimmed to embers, Jonah lay half awake in the chair, listening. Snow whispered against the roof, soft but endless. Near the hearth, the 5 women slept close together beneath a single blanket. For the first time since the war, Jonah felt something he hadn't dared to name belonging. Outside, the land froze. Inside, life endured. Morning rose blue and brittle, the kind of cold that made breath hang in the air like smoke. Jonah McCrae stepped outside before dawn, the weight of the night still in his shoulders. The valley below Sable Mesa was white and endless, untouched except for a single set of tracks near the northern fence fresh boot prints. He followed them for a few yards before the wind erased their edges. Someone had been close, watching. When he came back, the cabin was awake. Kiona was stirring the coals, coaxing life from the ashes. Dason and Sandy were patching a torn curtain near the door. Ava sat near the stove, her foot unwrapped for the first time, pink scars glinting in the light. Nayeli stood at the window, arms crossed, eyes distant. There were tracks, Jonah said. Nayeli turned. How close? Too close. She didn't flinch. Then we prepare. No one argued. Dason began cutting strips of leather to reinforce the door hinges. Kiona packed the flour and salt into sacks that could be moved quickly. Even Ava, limping, gathered small bundles of herbs and dried meat. Jonah went to the shed and checked the traps, sharpening every tool that could serve as a weapon if needed. The day moved in silence. Every sound a hammer tap, a creak of wood felt louder than it should. Around midday, Nayeli joined Jonah outside. She wore his spare coat, too big for her shoulders. If they come, she said, it won't just be for questions. Jonah nodded, splitting another log. I know. Her eyes softened for the first time that day. You could still send us away. Keep yourself safe. He looked at her, snowflakes catching in his beard. I've done enough running, he said. If they want trouble, they'll find me standing. Something flickered across her face, respect, maybe gratitude, or both. She picked up a fallen branch and began stacking it beside the woodpile. No words, just rhythm, the sound of 2 people working in quiet understanding. By dusk, the cabin was fortified in small, careful ways. Dason had nailed a board across the lower window. Kiona had hung blankets over the doors to muffle sound. Sonny had drawn symbols along the inner frame of the hearth protective marks, she said in a whisper. Ava, though weak, insisted on keeping watch from the window, her fingers tracing circles on the frost. That night, the wind howled low through the canyon, carrying the echo of coyotes or something less wild, more human. Jonah and Nayeli took turns keeping watch. She sat near the stove, the light flickering across her face. He stayed by the window, rifle ready, eyes on the tree line. Hours passed. The others slept, huddled together for warmth. Nayeli rose quietly and crossed the room, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She stopped beside Jonah. You don't rest much, do you? He shook his head. Rest doesn't change what's out there. She looked at him, her voice softening. And what's in here? You think about that? Jonah didn't answer right away. He could feel her presence beside him close enough to touch, yet still cautious. I think about how this house used to be quiet, he said finally, and how that quiet doesn't feel the same anymore. Nayeli's lips curved, almost a smile. You mean you miss silence? No, he said. I think I was mistaking silence for peace. She studied him a moment longer, then laid a hand on his arm. You gave us safety, Jonah. Don't lose yours trying to protect ghosts. He turned toward her, the warmth of her hand grounding him more than the fire ever could. You're not ghosts, he said quietly. You're the only thing real that's walked through that door in years. For a long moment, they didn't move. Snow pressed against the window pane, muting the world. Outside was danger, cold, and rumor. Inside was firelight, breath, and something unnamed growing stronger by the hour. When dawn finally came, the land was still. No riders, no tracks, only the clean, empty hush of winter. Jonah stepped out into the pale light, the sky wide and bruised with dawn. Behind him, he heard Nayeli's voice through the door. We stay? He turned, the ghost of a smile touching his face. We stay, he said. And for the first time since the war, Jonah McCrae realized that staying standing still might be the bravest thing he'd ever done. The thaw came slow that week, not with warmth but with light. Each morning, the frost on the window melted a little sooner, and Jonah McCrae began to feel the weight of what they had built. Something fragile but steady, something worth defending. Days passed without new tracks in the snow. The women worked as if they'd always lived there. Kiona scrubbed the floor until it shone pale in the Sunday. Dason fixed the gate latch with wire. Ava, now walking again, tended the goats with shy pride. Sonny carved more symbols into the mantel, circles and lines Jonah couldn't read but somehow understood, prayers of belonging. Nayeli spent her mornings outside, gathering dry sage and bark, her breath rising in silver threads. Jonah watched from the porch, pretending to sharpen tools but really studying the calm that had returned to her face. The bruises had faded, but the strength beneath them hadn't. She moved like a woman who refused to disappear again. That evening, while the women cooked by the fire, Jonah opened the old army chest under his bed. Inside were papers, deeds, filings, letters with broken seals. He spread them across the table, smoothed the creases with his hand. Nayeli glanced over from the stove. "What's all that?" "Proof," Jonah said, "that this ranch and everything on it are mine." She frowned. "You think that protects us?" He met her eyes. "Maybe not in the world out there, but it can on paper." The others gathered as he wrote. Ink scratched across the pages their names, one by one. Nayeli Whitecloud, Dason, Kiona, Sonny, Ava. He listed them as household members under legal protection of Jonah McCrae, citing his veterans grant from the U.S. Army. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a piece of law strong enough to keep them from being hunted again. When he finished, he leaned back, shoulders tense. "These papers can make you ghosts," he said, "or they can make you safe. Depends who reads them." Nayeli stepped closer. "You're giving your name to us." "I'm giving you what I can," Jonah replied. Dason took the papers first, scanning them carefully, lips tight but approving. "No one ever wrote my name on anything before," she said quietly. Then she passed them to Kiona, who smiled faintly and touched the ink like it was sacred. One by one, each woman read her name, and each time Jonah felt the room grow heavier, not with fear, but with meaning. When it reached Nayeli, she studied the page a long time. "You realize what this says?" she murmured. "It says we belong here." Jonah nodded. "That's the idea." Later, after supper, when the others had gone to rest, Nayeli stayed behind. The firelight danced along her face, soft and gold. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Maybe not," Jonah answered. "But I wanted to." She stepped closer, her eyes holding his. "You think a paper makes a family?" "No," he said, "but it keeps the wolves away long enough to build one." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled, small, real, the kind that could unmake years of silence. She touched his hand, her fingers rough from cold. "Then we'll build it," she whispered. That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the documents folded neatly beside him, and listened to the breathing of 5 women who now carried his name in ink. He had spent years guarding empty walls, afraid of losing what little he had left. Now, he realized, he finally had something worth losing. Outside, the moon climbed over Sable Mesa, turning the snow silver. Inside, the papers lay between them, proof of something the law could never understand but the heart already had. They weren't guests anymore. They were home. Spring crept quietly over Sable Mesa. It didn't come with flowers or warmth, just the slow surrender of snow to soil. The air still bit at dawn, but the valley began to breathe again. Water trickled through the creek bed. Goats wandered further from the shed. And for the first time since winter began, Jonah McCrae left the door open while he worked. Life settled into rhythm. Each morning, Kiona lit the stove before the sun cleared the ridge. Sonny hung strips of hide to dry above the hearth, her carved symbols growing across the beams, a silent history of those who now called this cabin home. Dason repaired the fence that wind had torn loose, hammering nails with sure, calm strikes. Ava, limping less each day, planted wild onion bulbs in a patch of soft earth behind the cabin. And Nayeli, she became the steady heart of it all. She moved through the house with quiet certainty, her presence enough to anchor everyone. Jonah had grown used to her voice, the rhythm of her footsteps, the sight of her brushing snow from her hair. He had spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone. Now, the thought of her absence felt impossible. One afternoon, Jonah returned from the ridge with a small sack of supplies from Dry Creek Post. The air smelled of thawed pine and wet clay. As he crossed the yard, he noticed the changes: a wind chime made of bone and twine hanging by the window, a hand-carved bench beside the door, and a row of new footprints that led to the shed and back. His cabin was no longer his alone. It was theirs. Inside, laughter drifted through the smoke. The women were baking real bread this time. Kiona and Ava kneaded dough at the table, their hands dusted white with flour. Dason stirred a pot by the stove, humming a tune that didn't belong to any language Jonah knew. Sonny was sketching something on the wall with charcoal, a circle of 6 figures holding hands. When she saw him, she smiled shyly and stepped aside so he could see. "It's us," she said softly. Jonah nodded. He didn't have words for what rose in his chest, something between gratitude and ache. He placed the sack on the table and took a seat near the fire. Nayeli was mending his coat, needle flashing in her hand. She looked up when he entered, eyes meeting his with that quiet strength he'd come to rely on. "You went to town," she said. "Only to file the papers," Jonah answered. "They're official now. Stamped." She set the coat aside. "And what did they say?" "Nothing," Jonah said with a small grin. "They looked at the forms, looked at me, and didn't ask a single question." Relief rippled through the room. Dason exhaled. Ava smiled. Kiona crossed herself, whispering a thank you to whatever power she believed had watched over them. That night, after the meal was done and the fire burned low, Jonah stepped outside. The air was damp and full of promise. From inside came the soft murmur of voices, the sound of women living, breathing, belonging. Nayeli joined him a moment later, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "You did more than protect us," she said quietly. Jonah turned toward her. "I didn't do anything you couldn't have done for me." "That's not true," she said. "You opened your door." They stood side by side, watching the moon climb over the hills. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was full, like the space between heartbeats. Jonah glanced at her, then at the faint glow spilling from the cabin window. "This place feels different now," he said. "It's alive," she answered. "It remembers laughter again." Nayeli reached out and touched his hand. It wasn't a question, nor a confession. Just truth, simple and warm against the cold night air. Jonah closed his fingers around hers, rough palm against soft skin. Behind them, the wind chime rattled gently. The symbols on the walls flickered in firelight. The earth, thawing beneath their feet, promised growth. For the first time, in a long time, Jonah McCrae believed that tomorrow would not bring loss, only continuation. And for people who had spent their lives running, that was everything. The thaw had fully come to Sable Mesa by mid-April. The last of the snow melted into rivulets that fed the Rio Bonito, and a faint green crept across the valley like a cautious dream. Jonah McCrae stood on the porch that morning, watching the mist lift from the ridgeline. It had been 5 months since he'd opened his door to the women, 5 months since silence had become company. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee, smoke, and bread. He could hear the clatter of tin plates, the soft hum of Kiona's tune, the occasional laugh from Ava. Sonny was painting again, her hands stained with charcoal, while Dason argued with her about whether the porch rail needed another coat of pitch. The noise was gentle, familiar. Jonah found himself smiling before he realized it. Nayeli stepped out beside him, a shawl around her shoulders, her dark braid loose down her back. "You're smiling," she said quietly. "Guess I forgot how," Jonah replied. They stood together in the chill sunlight. Below them, the goats picked their way through the mud, nosing at the first shoots of grass. "It feels strange," she said, "to stay in one place without fear." "You earned that," Jonah answered. "All of you did." She turned her face toward him. "And you, Jonah? What did you earn?" He paused. "Maybe peace, or something close to it." That afternoon, he rode down to Dry Creek Post for supplies. It was the first time he'd left the ranch in weeks. The ride was long, the land open and silent but for the wind. When he reached the small cluster of wooden buildings, conversation stopped. Men outside the saloon watched him dismount. A few nodded, others didn't. Word had already spread. Inside the post office, the clerk, an older man named Hendricks, peered over his spectacles. "Back again, McCrae," Hendricks said. "Heard you filed some papers last month. 5 dependents, was it?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "That's right. 5 women, folks say. Apache, too." The clerk's tone carried neither anger nor approval, just curiosity sharpened by gossip. "They work for me," Jonah said evenly. "Must be good help." Hendricks slid the receipt toward him. "Word is, a lawman from Wolf Hollow was asking about you." Jonah's hand froze. "When?" "Week ago. Said he might ride up this way come summer." Jonah pocketed the paper, thanked the man, and left without another word. Outside, the wind smelled of dust and distance. He had expected this. Mercy didn't come cheap on the frontier. It always drew suspicion. When he returned that evening, the ranch looked almost like a small village. Smoke curled from the chimney. The sound of hammering echoed from behind the shed. Dason and Kiona were fixing a pen for the newborn goat kids. Ava waved from the doorway, her smile bright beneath the fading light. But Jonah's chest felt heavy. He handed the supplies to Sonny and went to sit on the porch. Nayeli joined him after a moment, sensing the change. "What happened in town?" she asked. He hesitated, then told her about the clerk, about the lawman. She listened without blinking. "They won't stop, will they?" she said softly. "No," Jonah said, "but they'll think twice before climbing this hill. And if they don't?" He turned to her. "Then we make sure they understand what this place is." Her expression softened, but there was iron beneath it. "And what is it, Jonah?" He looked past her, toward the fields where the last snow was dissolving into mud and seed. "It's home," he said. "Ours." The following days passed in quiet industry. Sonny began carving the ranch's new name onto a wooden sign. Home Mesa. Kiona planted herbs and corn near the creek bed. Ava built a scarecrow from Jonah's old coat and straw. Dason trained the goats to stay near the pen, muttering to them like a patient sergeant. And Nayeli organized it all with a calm Jonah admired more than he could say. Still, at night, he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on the ridge. Sometimes he'd wake before dawn and stand by the window, rifle ready, staring into the gray half-light. But the land stayed empty. Only the wind moved. One evening, after supper, Jonah told them what he'd heard. The laughter around the fire died slowly. Sonny lowered her carving knife. Ava's hands clenched in her lap. "Another lawman?" Kiona whispered. "Maybe more than one," Jonah said. "But it's months off yet." Dason straightened. "Then we have months to get stronger." Nayeli nodded. "We've run before. We won't this time." Jonah looked around at their faces, the same women who'd arrived bleeding and frostbitten. Now they met his gaze, with the calm of people who had already survived the worst the world could do. Spring deepened. Grass spread green and soft across the lower slope. The cabin no longer smelled of fear. It smelled of baking bread, leather, and life. Some nights, when the moon was full, they sat on the porch telling quiet stories. Sonny spoke of her father's herd. Kiona told of her first hunt. Dason recited songs from her grandmother's tongue. Ava fell asleep with her head on Nayeli's lap. And Jonah listened, feeling time loosen its grip. He had lived years in silence, believing solitude was safety. But now, in their laughter, he heard something truer. Safety was not the absence of others, it was the presence of those who stayed. One night, Nayeli lingered after the others had gone inside. She leaned against the porch rail, her hair loose, her eyes reflecting firelight. "You know they'll talk," she said quietly. "They'll call it wrong what we've built here." Jonah's voice was steady. "Let them talk. They'll say we're not a family." He reached out, touched her wrist. "Then they've never seen one." She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled, small and tired and full of peace. "You sound sure." "I am." "Why?" "Because you're still here," he said. The wind moved through the pines above them, carrying the scent of thawed earth and smoke. Nayeli rested her head on his shoulder. Neither spoke again. The stars came out one by one, until the valley shimmered silver and alive. At dawn, Jonah woke early to the sound of quiet movement, Kiona feeding the goats, Dason chopping wood, Sonny sweeping the porch. Ordinary sounds, small and sacred. He stepped outside and watched the sun climb over Sierra Blanca. The light caught the cabin windows, turning them gold. For the first time, he realized that everything broken in his life had led him here to this hill, this home, these people. The world below might never understand what they were, might call it scandal or sin. But up here, none of that mattered. The land had accepted them. The earth had thawed. And Jonah McCrae, who had once believed he was built only for solitude, finally understood the truth of what he'd built. A home not given by law or blood, but chosen and earned by love. Early summer arrived at Sable Mesa with a hush, soft wind moving through the pines and sunlight bright as brass. The valley had thawed, and for the first time in years, Jonah McCrae felt peace real, solid, and warm. The cabin smelled of bread and sage, laughter drifted through its walls, and every mark on the table a knife cut. A coffee ring was proof of life lived, not merely survived. Each morning began the same. Kiona stoked the fire, Dason checked the goats, Sonny carved small protective signs above the doorway, Ava gathered herbs by the creek, and Naomi moved quietly among them, her presence steady as breath. Jonah often watched her without meaning to, struck by how natural it now felt to see her there as if she'd always belonged. Then, one afternoon, a dust trail rose along the ridge. Jonah saw it before anyone else, a single rider approaching slow and sure. He knew the sound of that gate. The deputy from Dry Creek had returned. When the man dismounted, the women retreated inside. "Evening, McCrae," the deputy said, hat in hand. "Heard talk again. 5 Apache Widows living on your land. Folks wonder if it's proper." Jonah's jaw tightened. "They work here. They're safe here. That's all the law needs to know." The deputy looked past him toward the cabin windows. "Not everyone sees it that way. Some think you're hiding them." Jonah met his stare, voice calm but cutting. "If protecting people from the cold is a crime, then I'm guilty." The deputy studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "You've got heart, McCrae, but heart gets men killed." He turned his horse and rode away, dust hanging in the air long after. Inside, Nayeli was waiting. "He'll be back," she said softly. "Maybe," Jonah replied, "but so will we." That evening, as twilight settled, he took her hand and led her outside. "The world won't understand us," he said. Nayeli smiled faintly. "Then let the world be wrong." 2 days later, they stood beneath the old spruce tree behind the cabin. No preacher, no crowd, only the wind and 5 women who had once been strangers. Jonah took her hand. "You stay with me," he said. "And I stay with you," she answered. The vows were simple, whispered like a prayer. That night, the cabin glowed with firelight and laughter. Nayeli rested her head against Jonah's chest, her breath soft against his skin. He looked toward the fields, where young corn shimmered in moonlight, and knew what had finally come to pass. After years of silence and loss, Jonah McCrae was no longer a man waiting for life to end. He was a man who had found a reason to live. The summer sun burned high over Sable Mesa, turning the earth gold and dry. The creek ran slower now, whispering through the reeds, and the corn behind the cabin stood tall, green against the pale dust. The air smelled of cedar and rain waiting to fall. Jonah McCrae rose early that morning, as he always did. But today felt different, quiet, full of something new. Inside, the cabin stirred to life. Kiona hummed while mixing dough. Dason mended a saddle strap by the door. Sonny sketched in charcoal along the window frame, small circles of protection. Ava laughed as she tried to shoo the goats from the garden. And Nayeli, she was at the basin behind the cabin, rinsing cloths, sunlight glinting off the water. When Jonah came to her, she looked over her shoulder, her hair shining in the heat. "You're late," she teased softly. He smiled. "Had to see it all first. This what we built." They stood for a moment, listening to the wind move through the valley. The place that once echoed with loneliness was now alive, filled with work, laughter, and the sound of living things. Nayeli placed his hand on her stomach. "Ava noticed first," she said. "I didn't want to tell you until I was sure." Jonah froze. "You mean?" She nodded. In a few months, there'll be another voice in this house. He didn't speak at first, only pulled her close, his hand trembling slightly as it rested over hers. You scared? He asked. She shook her head. Not anymore. Later that day, the others gathered beneath the spruce tree where Jonah and Nayeli had spoken their vows. They planted a circle of sage and corn around its roots, a sign of protection and growth. Dason called it a blessing. Sonny carved a new mark into the bark, 6 lines joined by a single curve. Family. That evening, the sky turned copper and violet, the kind of color that never lasted long enough to describe. Jonah sat on the porch with Nayeli in his lap, her head against his chest. The others' voices drifted from inside Kiona's laughter, Ava's song, Dason's dry humor keeping them all in line. Jonah looked toward the fields. It's strange, he said quietly. The world thinks peace means being alone, but they're wrong. Nayeli smiled without opening her eyes. Peace is having somewhere to return to. The wind softened, carrying the scent of sage and rain. The sun slipped below the ridge, leaving the land wrapped in amber light. Jonah tightened his arms around her, knowing that whatever storms might come, this ground, this life, was theirs. Sable Mesa was no longer a refuge, it was a home. And for a man who once lived only for silence, Jonah McCrae had finally found something worth speaking for. A family, a promise, and a love that would outlast the wind. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the warmth of that cabin on Sable Mesa, the quiet strength of Nayeli, or the redemption of Jonah McCrae, then stay with us a little longer. Every tale in Wild West love stories is a candle lit against the loneliness of the frontier, a reminder that even in the harshest land, kindness can build a home. Subscribe to our channel and let these stories keep riding with you. Each week we bring you new journeys through dust and devotion, ranchers who learn to love again, women who turn sorrow into courage, strangers who find family beneath the endless sky. Your subscription helps keep these voices alive, the forgotten ones, the brave ones, the ones who never stopped believing in second chances. So saddle up with us. Click subscribe, ring the bell, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because out here, across deserts and mountains, across time itself, we're all travelers chasing the same thing: a little bit of light, a little bit of love, and a place to finally call home. Subscribe now and let the next Wild West love story begin.